Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Taylor Wessing's International Employment webinar. This is Sean Nesbitt speaking. I'm a partner in Taylor Wessing based in London, and I'm joined today by speakers from Germany, Michael Pils, from Central Europe and Austria, Brigitte Sammer, Ros Siesing from Holland, Tiffaine Pouzin from Paris, Helen Farr from London, and Takahiro Nakayama from Japan. We're going to discuss the challenges facing companies operating in Europe and Asia at the time of one of the greatest crises since the Second War. This isn't just a health crisis, but an income crisis. It's obviously an income crisis for workers in the gig economy and in those industries which are most heavily affected now by current curfews, hospitality, transport, and retail. But it's also a crisis for business income in the medium term. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, has warned that as many as 25 million jobs may be lost, and those are jobs of spenders and consumers as well as workers. So the ILO has called for some concerted international action to prevent large systemic shocks and long-term recession. We're going to be talking today about some of the systemic actions that governments are proposing in Europe to soften the effect of the current crisis. We're also going to be discussing, and I'm looking now at slide 2, we're also going to be discussing the reactions of some international companies already, attitudes of regulators, and what people are doing to keep people out of the workplace who may not want to be there versus dealing with vulnerable workers who want to be at home because they're caring for other people, but who might be needed in the building. As I said, we'll talk earlier about pay and state aid and what countries such as the Netherlands and Germany are doing to support businesses against the different support offered by the UK, for example. We have to talk about redundancy and restructuring, but we also want to look forward to some medium and longer term issues. What's going to happen with disputes? What kind of disputes will this crisis create? And what will this crisis do for your conduct in negotiation of disputes? What happens when all the courts shut down or witnesses aren't able to travel to give evidence? And we want to talk about some tactics and planning for how you conduct and resolve disputes in this time. We'll also quickly cover immigration issues. That's a neglected part of the community at the moment because there's not much travel, but there are people who are stuck in countries where they don't want to be in, and there will be a resurgence of a wish for foreign travel. Just as China starts to come out of its recession and will want people to travel, we'll need to deal with what has changed and how you can help people who can't access passport offices, for example. Lastly, we'll talk, as I said, about the future and what this crisis may do to affect the path you take in helping your businesses survive and prosper. Now I'm going to hand over to Michael to talk us further forward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean, and it's a great pleasure to have you on this webinar. Indeed, if we talk about this crisis, we have two main issues we should focus on: business continuity on the one hand and public support. We think that it is wise and it is recommendable to ensure that you have all the necessary information be provided on state public support in each jurisdiction. It is certainly necessary that you consult with your lawyers about the right use of legal tech and the legal tools in order to manage the crisis. And of course, we should be smart, collaborative, and creative in order to find new business solutions. So Germany is trying to organize sometimes the production in a certain way to ensure that the supply chain is not breaking down completely. So we see some new creative solutions of home office regulations in Japan. So this is certainly something you should analyze and consult with your lawyers. If we see what are the solutions of the companies, then you can see that the international companies are trying to do a lot of restrictions, but also trying to enable home office solutions. And this is something which is definitely one interesting part of this crisis, that we are focusing on new working styles, like a broad way of home office, as we see. The same is true with ensuring the production. So we see that the companies are restructuring their production cycles and trying to have the emergency team on board. This is what we see in all the jurisdictions. If we focus on China, in particular on Japan, which is on the very bottom of this slide, you can see that the Chinese entities, all of them are offering home office solutions, and this is particularly interesting in Japan. Nakayama Sensei has confirmed that there's still a very big presence in the office for Japanese people, and that the home office solution now is really a new challenge of Japanese working style. So that's from my side very briefly, and I'm very happy to continue now with the next slide regarding national infections.
Sure. Well, before we do that, let's just talk a little bit, if we can, about what some specific companies are doing in the UK at the moment. I'm speaking from an office in my house and asking my kids to be very quiet, and the dog is in the garden. And there's a lot of home working now in London. Helen, can you tell us maybe what a couple of companies have done to support people in terms of paying them or other things they've asked them to do?
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. And I think the harsh reality is now that most people are working from home, if at all possible. But what we're understanding is that there are a number of businesses where they are offering support. So if people can't work from home or are unable to work, they are being paid. And so one example of that is Credit Suisse, where they're offering their staff 30 days full pay if they're unable to work. And others are offering perhaps not quite such a long period, but say up to 10 days of full payment on salary. Also, we're starting to get reports already that businesses are deferring hiring and are only hiring at the moment when it's sort of for a strategic need. So people are moving and responding quite quickly, I think, to this crisis.
10 days strikes a chord with me in terms of what a lot of companies are doing in terms of paying people who aren't sick but can come in, but perhaps aren't sick but aren't able to come in because they've got other obligations. Rose, can I ask you to talk a little bit about what's going in Holland? And I think this probably goes hand in hand with what the laws are on national infection protection. The UK is still finding its way in terms of lockdowns and so on. Other countries are further ahead than us, and there's a relationship between the national laws on infection control and what businesses are doing. So perhaps, Rose, on slide 5, you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure, Sean. Thank you. So in the Netherlands, we don't really have specific infection protection laws, but employees are generally quite well protected. Employees who are sick due to the coronavirus are entitled to continued wages. The normal Dutch sick pay regime applies, where employees are entitled to a maximum of 104 weeks of wages during sickness, with a statutory minimum of 70%. If the employee is not prevented from work due to sickness, but because of quarantine measures, the employee will be entitled to 100% of his usual benefits. But also in case of other absence, for example, if an employee is stuck abroad because of travel restrictions due to the coronavirus, this is also at the employee's risk and expense.
So generally some pretty generous provisions there for sick pay and for parenting rights. And are those borne by the company, or does the state pay for those?
No, they are borne by the company. There is some specific state aid, but I think we might want to discuss that generally for other countries. Yeah, and we'll come on to that. For those listening, we'll come on and go through that for every country, what state aid is available on slides 7 and 8. And I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. We know that our German friends are processing a lot of applications for employers now for state aid. Just as we come on to that, let's hear from maybe Tiffaine, if we can, on what are the current national controls on travel and socializing in France and what effect that is having.
Yes, of course. So in France, very restrictive measures have been taken by the French government during the last days, which reduce the action scope of people, but also of companies. First and last Thursday, the president has announced that all schools and universities would close down as from the following Monday, and that employees were encouraged to work from home. 2 days later, on last Saturday, the Prime Minister has announced that all restaurants, bars, cinemas, and more generally all shops and establishments open to the public that are not essential to the French people's life should be closed. And finally, on Monday, the President declared the confinement of the French population. So this means, in practice, that all French people must stay at home unless it is necessary to go out for a specific purpose. So the specific purpose can be work if home working is impossible, and only if home working is impossible. So there are police checks in the streets. Persons traveling or only being outside of their home must be able to show a statement justifying the reason for the movement.
So if the police can stop you on the street in France, does that mean your employer has to provide a letter or an email explaining that you're required to travel to work?
Yes, in fact, you need to have 2 affidavits. You need to have one affidavit written by you, declaring your name, etc., and that you are not able to perform home working, or that the meeting you are going to cannot be postponed. And you also need to have the same affidavit from your employer, which also describes the way. So if you are taking public transportation of your car to go to work, and what kind of distance you have to travel exactly.
Wow, so it really is almost like being occupied by a foreign army or something.
It is quite tense here. So people are just at home in practice, unless they are really required to go to work.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything as vivid as that description of life in France to describe their current environment?
Maybe just briefly for Germany to jump into, we look to our friends, colleagues, and see that the situation is becoming worse and worse. And in Germany, so we expect that the public restrictions will also be increased in the next couple of days. Yesterday, our Lord Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, has made a very emotional speech to the German people, stating that this is a very hard time for everyone and we have to cooperate. And this is something what we see on the companies side. So they are trying to reorganize their workforce and to be prepared for this worst case scenario of a 2 or 3 weeks shutdown.
Right. So really everybody has to pull together. I mean, that brings us on to slides 7 and 8, because the 2 biggest measures that governments seem to be encouraging, as you heard from Tiffaine, are working from home and also encouraging businesses to have people work short hours to protect jobs by reducing work rather than reducing jobs. So let's go through for each country what the governments are supporting with financial support or other practical support in measures for short-time work or layoffs or home work. And let's just start with Germany and go down through UK, Netherlands and France on the first slide.
Yeah, Germany is, as you correctly stated, Sean, very much publishing a new legislation regarding public state aid. So we have a short-time work, which is giving some benefits. The legislation is brand new, and we expect to have a lot of discussion in the next couple of days. So we will see how this will work in practice. We expect that the authority, the unemployment agency, will be not able to answer all questions immediately. So this is something which the companies are now requesting. So since this is a brand new law, we have to see how we have to apply this new law and to see how to do this. But on an employment viewpoint, it is very important that we have the right legal basis for this. So we need employment contracts or collective bargaining agreements in this respect, allowing short-time work. Same is in a particular true with home office regulations or other kinds of ways of remote work. So this is not so easy in Germany, but at the moment we see that the pragmatic perspective is sometimes more important as the correct application of legal framework. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just ask, in Germany, is there a payment to support businesses if they put people on short-time work, or is there any subsidy if you give people equipment for the home office? What's the cash?
Yeah, so the cash depends, of course, on the salary of the employee. So the company can apply for short-time work, and in this respect, if the prerequisites are given, the state agency will take over and pay a certain amount. And we use legal tech tools from Taylor Wessing Legal Tech to calculate those numbers. You will find them very briefly on our webpage. So that you can see that how much the payment will be.
So you can get, is it right? I think you can get up to maybe 60% of the net wage, 65%?
Yeah, something in this respect.
Okay. Helen, bit of a contrast with the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, in the UK, yes, we do have sort of statutory protection for employees who are sort of subject to the short-time working regime, but our current system is much less generous. The maximum entitlement that employees can claim is up to 5 days worth of lost earnings, and that's over a 3-month period. But to make that even worse, the amount that the employees can claim is capped at £29 a day. So what that means in real terms is £145 over a 3-month period. So it's much less generous than certainly is the case in Germany. If employees are subject to short working for a longer period, so a consecutive period of a month, and they've got sort of 2 years or more service, yes, they can apply for a statutory redundancy payment, but they're unlikely to want to do that because in reality that's going to mean that their job comes to an end anyway. So the harsh reality is that for most employees, they are going to, if they're obviously off sick, they can get the benefit of either contractual sick pay or more likely statutory sick pay, but that is currently paid at the rate of £94.25 a week, which again is really not very generous at all. And that will apply if you are ill and also self-isolating. But a little bit of good news though, on Tuesday our Chancellor did announce that homeowners who lose income because of coronavirus and are unable to meet monthly payments including mortgage will be offered a 3-month mortgage holiday. And there are some suggested plans that the government will go much further to support people's financial security, but we're waiting details of that.
Unlike Germany and unlike, I think, Netherlands, there's no direct support for employers to get a subsidy or a loan from government to help keep people in jobs. It's going to fall on employers to decide whether they want to and can keep people in jobs or otherwise cut costs as suits them.
I mean, there is this suggestion. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say there is a proposal that employers can apply for a £10,000 loan, but it's not clear, obviously, whether that would cover employment costs or their own business costs. So you're right. I mean, the bulk of this is going to fall on employers, sadly.
Okay. All right. How about Netherlands? From what we heard earlier, Rose, I'm expecting to hear maybe a more supportive environment for employers in the Netherlands.
Yeah, that's correct. Employees do get direct support. The government actually revoked the working time reduction scheme last Tuesday and introduced a new measure called the Emergency Fund Employment Bridging. Employers can apply for this fund in case of a turnover decrease of at least 20% calculated as from the 1st of March 2020. And they can file an application at the Labour Office for compensation. And the start date will still be announced as soon as possible. but employees can get that compensation for 3 months at a maximum of 90% compensation for wage costs. And the Labour Office will provide an advance payment of 80%. And on the basis of the actual decrease in turnover, the Labour Office will determine the final compensation afterwards. So with this facility, employers can still continue paying their employees in full. And it actually also applies for flex workers. The only requirement, which is quite important, is that the employer commits not to apply for dismissal for employees for economic reasons during the compensation period of 3 months.
So it's sort of like the reverse of state aid to create a new job. If we give you money to pay people, you must not terminate them for the period of the support.
Yeah, you should keep them. Yes, exactly.
But it's not a very long commitment. It's just for the time of essentially just for the time of the payment.
Yeah.
All right. Do you think that it will become easier to terminate people in Holland during this crisis? Do you see any legislation for that to happen? Maybe it's not necessary.
No, I actually don't think so. At least for now, there are no indications for that. No.
Okay. So France, it sounds very centralized, very authoritarian, the French reaction. Is there support from the French state for employers?
Yes, there are support from the French state. So first, as in other countries, so companies affected by the crisis have the possibility to apply for short-time working. So it is particularly the case for all companies who had to close down temporarily because of their activity, such as restaurants and bars notably, but also for all companies which activity is directly linked to the activity of the companies who had to close down or adversely affected by the current crisis. So short-time working in France is a state scheme by which the company has the possibility to close down temporarily or to reduce its activity. It is subject to the Labour Administration's agreement, and if the company's application is approved online, the employees are requested to stay at home and they are paid part of their remuneration. It corresponds to approximately 84% of the employee's net remuneration. So the French government has announced that it would reimburse the full costs linked to the payment of the remunerations in the framework of the short-time working to the companies, so that this short-time working does not cost anything to the companies concerned. So a decree is currently being finalized providing for this full reimbursement. What we note currently, of course, due to the current situation, is that a large number of French companies are applying for this scheme, and the French administration has been asked to consider the request as really an urgent matter. So this is for short-time working, and moreover, a certain number of state aids which are currently being created for the companies, such as, for example, so delays in the payment of taxes, assistance by the state in the renegotiation of credits with banks, etc. It can be even tax rebates for companies with important economic difficulties. So the president has announced that no company would be left behind.
Right. And is there a period for this support? Holland's 3 months. Is there a fixed period for how much support French companies may have?
For the short time working, it's maximum 12 months. It will be maximum 12 months in the new decree. For the time being, according to the current legislation, it's 6 months. We also have this prohibition to dismiss the persons who are on short-time working, but it is only during the period of the short-time working. So as soon as it stops, the company could proceed with layoffs.
I talked about this being support for French companies. I should just check. I assume it's support from the French government for any company operating in France, not only French-owned companies.
Yes, it's for any company operating in France. But you need to have a specific economic situation, of course.
Right. Brigitte, how about Austria and Central Europe?
Yeah, so this is quite changing fast, not only in Austria but also in other countries. I just heard today that yesterday in Hungary there are far-reaching measures introduced. As regards Austria, there's a new concept of Corona short-time work already elaborated during the last days. It's already in force and companies are applying. However, it's still subject to amendments. It will be changed within the next days in order to grant more state aid to the employers. The main advantage is actually flexibility. So the working time can be reduced even to 0%. However, in total, during a period which is in general 3 months, but can be extended to further 3 months. So during the agreed period, at least 10% have to be worked at least at the end of the period. Actually, the payment obligation of the employer is between 80% and 95%. However, of course, there's state aid for the payment. The employer has to pay what is actually worked. So, for example, for the 10% that are worked, the employer has to pay these 10%, and the rest in general is paid by the state. There is at the moment discussion about social security contributions, whether they have to be borne by the employers or will also be taken over by the state. I think it will be the employer contributions that will be taken over, but we will see within the next days. Right. Yeah, what is also is that we need the consent of the Works Council, and if there's no Works Council, from every employee, and in addition from the social partners. However, we have actually the confirmation from them that they will consent to these concept agreements quite quickly within 48 hours. However, at the moment, everybody is waiting for the new provisions and then to submit all the applications for short-term work.
Right. So I'm hearing a couple of main things here so far. We'll talk a little bit about China and Japan. One is that most continental European countries have some form of state aid to support businesses who retain staff but put them on short-time work. It's not completely clear what the criteria are, and there could be delays in processing them, but there may be awards for 3 months in Holland, 12 months in France, to support a business if you don't terminate people. So that is a reason. Basically, it's intended to slow down the shock of redundancies and restructuring, and to ask businesses to see if there are other solutions for a time. The second thing I'm hearing is that often you need to agree this not only with the worker or have the power under the contract to ask the worker to go short time, but you also still need to discuss it with representatives, a works council or social partners. That's not the case in the UK, but very common in continental Europe. How about China and Japan? Michael or Naka, do you have anything to say about those countries, about state support?
Yeah. Aid by the Japanese government is not so particularly unique compared to European countries, so I want to talk 2 points briefly. So first, the government aid for companies which have to downsize business. The requirement for this aid sales have decreased by at least 10% over the previous year. So there are also other tough requirements, such as certain employees should be absent from work all day, or all employees should be on short-time work for at least 1 hour. Therefore, short-time work for some employees is not so eligible for this aid. And we have another aid. We are trying to introduce another new aid, and I think it's kind of unique. Our government plans to introduce new aid to school closure. If a parent takes a leave to take care of a child who goes to elementary school and that school is closed, the government provides 100% of the allowance, and requirements will be determined in the future. It's not introduced yet, and we are also considering providing similar aid for freelancers.
Interesting. So, I mean, I know that school care and freelancers are important topics in the UK. We've had a big rise in freelancer work and non-typical employment, where people don't have a large employer to rely on, and maybe don't have enough social security to support them. Our schools are closing now in London, and across the UK. We have cancelled examinations. Leaving school examinations won't take place in the UK this summer. And there's a lot of thought going into supporting parents by having some schools open so that their children can go there to be cared for. But employers are going to be forced to support workers with school-aged children who now have those children at home for some time. And again, I think in the UK that burden is not so much fulfilled by the state, but more expected to be taken up by employers, either because of legal rights for children, people with children, or just because there's a social expectation. Let's talk a little bit about 2 or 3 of these scenarios on slide 9. Helen, maybe you could talk about vulnerable workers and rights in the UK.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the starting point has to be, and you touched on it, that I think those working in the gig economy are actually incredibly vulnerable at the moment. Sort of anecdotally, we're hearing that, you know, they're potentially going to be the first to be laid off because they have no employment protection and no employment rights. If there is going to be any restructuring or redundancy, they're definitely at risk in that sense. They're also unlikely to qualify for any payment at all if they are sort of forced to be either, you know, unable to provide services to care for children, or they need to self-isolate for whatever reason. And I'm aware that some businesses are looking to sort of make payments to those who are working maybe on a self-employed or freelance basis. But you do have to take care when you're doing that, because absolutely you don't want to sort of change employment status or impact on tax positions. So I think those working in the gig economy are very vulnerable. Equally, those who are carers, you know, there is a system where we have sort of time off to care for dependents in the UK, and that would give some protection in terms of people being able to take leave. Other businesses are looking at sort of allowing people to work more flexibly and to allow sort of childcare arrangements. Some companies are looking at, you know, if you're in a family, if you're in a couple and both of you are at home working, can you split the childcare between you? People may be asked to give up holiday or to take unpaid leave. So there are a range of options out there, and some of them are obviously are set down by statute. But those with caring responsibilities are in quite a difficult position. But more than that, we've also got the impact of those who are over 70, those with underlying health conditions, and those who are pregnant, all of whom it's been suggested that they should also self-isolate or work from home. And for many people in those categories, they potentially won't be able to work from home. So the impact on them is that they're going to just be obviously in receipt of the statutory sick pay, which I've explained earlier is a very low amount of money. Those who are pregnant are in a slightly better position because there are specific regulations, the maternity and health and safety work regulations that apply to them, and that requires businesses to find a suitable job for pregnant workers that they could do to enable them to keep working and to protect their health. And if it's not possible, then they can be suspended on full pay. So that's great news for pregnant women, but maybe not so good news for businesses. And then obviously you have to be quite mindful with those with underlying health conditions, because they're likely to qualify as disabled within the Equalities Act definition, which is very broad in the UK. And so any suggestion of treating them less favourably, potentially dismissing them because they're unable to work, could amount to a claim. So it's a very mixed position, I think, for vulnerable workers, and they don't have a terribly good regime in terms of protection.
So although we don't have strong economic state support, there are some rights that people have, nothing to do with coronavirus, but just to do with their equality laws and personal characteristics in the UK that employers need to think about in terms of the indirect impact on them and not mistakenly discriminate against those communities.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. I think businesses will have to be quite careful. Certainly, if they're trying to sort of implement a policy or some that people have to come into work, because that could absolutely be indirectly discriminatory against those who are, say, disabled, those who are over 70, etc., etc. So I think those with care and responsibilities who are predominantly women. So I do think businesses will have to, fall back, or sorry, employees rather will have to fall back on the protection that they have under other legislation rather than any specific protection at the moment that they have for this regime.
Right. Okay. So we spoke a little bit about sick pay in Holland and the Japanese school position. How about France? Any specific comment from your culture? And then let's talk a little bit about management liability. We've spoken a lot about protecting people or the rights of workers. It'll be interesting to come on to obligations of managers and how managers protect themselves with their actions. But before we do that, let's hear Tiffaine if you've got anything else from France.
Yes, we have a point currently regarding the motivation of employees, because as mentioned before, a large rate of the population in France continues to work but at home, with of course some challenges if they have young children who are also at home. So how to deal with the other employees who cannot work at home is a question that is frequently raised by our clients. So the French government insists that businesses should continue to run. However, as we are confined and that a large number of employees are working at home, the other employees who are not working at home often feel worried about the fact that they continue to go to work. So what is very important for companies in this situation is to adapt the employees' workstation in order to limit the risk of contamination. And we recommend in this case that the employee representatives and the occupational health services are fully involved in this process. We also recommend to continue to communicate with employees in order to reassure them on the measures taken by the company. In this respect, we have a specific issue in France, which is linked to the employees' use of the withdrawal right, what we call droit de retrait in France. Under this withdrawal right, the employee has the possibility to leave work when he or she considers that the work situation presents a serious or imminent danger to his or her life or health. So I think that you see the point at the moment. So we receive frequent questions in this respect, as some or many employees consider that their working place is not safe enough, and so they unilaterally decide to stop working and go home. And of course, if they use the withdrawal right, the company should continue paying them. So what should be the reaction to this behavior? So it of course depends on the circumstances, but the French government considers that if companies are applying the safety rules that are currently mandatory, so such as the barrier gesture, updating the risk assessment, etc., the employee's withdrawal right would be considered as unjustified. So from our experience, it will depend on the individual circumstances, notably, of course, the employee's state of health. However, in most cases, the withdrawal right will be considered as unjustified. So in this specific situation, we need to adapt on a regular basis and sometimes on a case-by-case basis. But what we see also is that there are many options in order to face this situation. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Great. So although worker rights are pretty strong in France, if you follow the central government's rules currently around health and safety, you should be protected from that more creative employee action. Interesting.
Yes, that's correct.
So Michael, Tiffaine, Brigitte, do you want to tell us a little bit about this concept of management responsibility and management liability, which I think in your countries can be stronger in terms of criminal liability and more defined responsibility perhaps than in the UK or we're used to in America?
Exactly. Thank you very much, Sean. Of course, we have a crisis all over the world, but still the legal obligations of the management must be fulfilled. And this is, of course, one of the most pressuring questions of our clients, how to comply with the law in times of crisis. Shall we ignore data protection law of employees? Shall we ignore privacy law? Shall we send everyone to home office and just have actions? This is certainly something we have to take into consideration. And the German law requires a certain structured method to avoid management liability. And we are trying to light on the path and to structure all areas, all business areas. So this depends on operative, on legal, on financial topics, and of course on the business section of the company. So this is something you have to be very careful with each particular situation of the management, and it is changing so rapidly that sometimes we just have 24 hours calls with clients on certain issues. From Germany. I think the same picture is in a certain way true in other jurisdictions, so we need to comply with the law in Germany, even if there's a crisis.
And is it the case that there's more individual accountability? Who goes? You can go to jail? Who goes to jail if you don't get right your coronavirus response or your legal compliance?
Yeah, indeed, the management team can go into jail, and of course all the people who are not consulting in line with the law and helping the management in this respect can also be, in a worst case scenario, be fined. And if you consider, for instance, medicine sector, nursery sector for elderly people, if something happens in this sector because the management made the wrong decision, we are not talking about financial harms. We are also talking about dead people, and this is something the management has to avoid. This is a clearly obligation in German law, health and safety law, for instance.
Yeah. Well, that might account for how it is that we have such a volume of material and structures for helping management plan on our coronavirus website. And when you look at the last slides, we'll come back to it, of course, but when you look at the last slide, there are a number of links to materials from each of the countries that we have prepared and that we will keep updated as this situation goes forward over the next few weeks and months to keep people up to date on developing practice and help you take ideas into your countries. Let's talk a little bit about those management principles, Michael, if you want to take us through that in terms of slides 12 and 13 onwards.
Yes, this is indeed true. We are trying to focus on some general recommendations in those slides, and we don't have to go into detail for each page. But the most important issue in those times is, of course, communication towards the employees, to the customers, to the supply chain. So it's important to have a good communication scheme and a centralized communication in the company. We are sometimes facing fake news. We are sometimes facing misinformation. So this is very challenging for the management and for the employees. So please ensure that the communication is in a certain way in place. Next page, you should also decide which kind of actions should be taken. Is it necessary, for instance, to consider your public relation strategy? Is it necessary to have a management resolution in order to go forward in those crisis scenarios? This is something we have to check on a case-to-case basis. Then, of course, you should always have some eyes on the trade unions, on the Works Council, and of course on the authorities. So depending on the industry sector, the clear communication, the clear connections towards the authority is very, very crucial in order to have some, let's say, kind of additional information, a kind of some ways of dealing with the current situation. This is something we are consulting, we are helping our clients in those very hard times. Right. The checklist may help you. So I think, John, you will have some interesting questions for me from the audience in this respect.
Yeah, and I'm going to pick one up, but keep questions coming through the link that you should be able to see on your screen. If you can't see a link on your screen, feel free to email me, s.nesbitt@taylorwessing.com, and it's Nesbitt is Nesbitt. This is a question that we have concerning a country not on the line. We have a network system and people can work from home. We're a professional service business. I have somebody who, instead of staying at home in London, wants to travel to Venice and be near their family during the corona crisis and work from Venice. What's your advice?
From a German perspective, it is very, very difficult to forbid these people going to Venice at this date, because we have no general restrictions. But in Europe, the borders are closed at the moment. We cannot leave. We cannot enter Italy. So from a factual perspective, it's impossible. From a labor law perspective, as the employer of this guy or of this young lady who wants to go to Italy, this is in clear contrast to the obligation of duty and taking care about the employer's interest in this respect. So we would consult with this individual and try to avoid letting him go to Italy.
Helen, have you got anything to add to that from a UK perspective?
Yeah, I think from the UK perspective, I think assuming you could get to Venice, I think as a responsible employer, you even when people are working from home, you still have to be satisfied that they're working in a safe environment, etc. And certainly employers would have a duty of care to ensure that where they're working is safe, that they're not at sort of an unnecessary risk of contracting the virus. And I think there could be potential impact there if they're sort of sent over knowingly, and the employers seem to sort of consent to that. The other practical issue is that certainly based on current guidance from the government, if people are coming back from Italy in particular, they do have to self-isolate for a period of 2 weeks minimum, and they wouldn't be able to come back to work anyway, so there's impacts there. So I think you would have to sort of really take a very careful view, make sure that wherever they're working is relatively safe, that they're not likely to be in contact with people that are exposed to the virus, etc., etc. So it's a difficult one, but I think you'd have to balance up all those risks.
I guess on the pay position, if they have to self-isolate on return, that's because of their voluntary decision to travel. So the company does not have to pay them their pay. Yeah. They get statutory sick pay, but that's not very much. If you let them travel, then you're still supposed to. In theory, you're supposed to check they have a safe place of work, but you can't check that. So I guess you have to give them some guidelines, sort of remote risk assessment. And there's then the question of still reminding them about safe hygiene practices, even though they're not in your workplace, they're doing your work. So a lot of administration to support that kind of voluntary decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think on balance, I think most employers would probably not do it, and I think that would probably be the best advice.
And from your perspective, it would be lawful to tell them to tell them not to go, to instruct them to remain working in the UK.
Well, I think given that there is that overarching duty of care to your employees that we've spoken about, and that it's in these circumstances it would be very difficult indeed to be satisfied that it is a safe place of work. I think on that justification, it would be the right thing to do.
Right. Okay. Well, we're coming quite naturally into a time of questions now. As I say, if there are questions you want to ask of us, use the box on the screen or email me. I'll come on to a question I wrote myself earlier, which is around disputes. And I'm looking now at slide 16. I've had a real question recently regarding payment of a bonus that was agreed as part of a settlement with a manager. And the manager has left the company and the number has been agreed in their termination arrangements. But now the trading of the company is very bad and they want to consider, are we obliged to pay this bonus now? Because it's really a reward for success that hasn't happened. And it's not the manager's fault, but it doesn't feel fair that we should pay a very large sum to this manager when we know we're going to be restructuring and making people redundant. That's an example of a dispute that we think will commonly now arise. I think in that case, when there's a signed agreement, unless somebody lied in the negotiations to obtain that number, then that money still has to be paid. It could be that businesses feel comfortable to ask managers to give up bonuses that have already been agreed or declared, whether they're normal bonuses or termination bonuses. There is some experience of doing this in the UK, usually when managers have left with some fault or criticism. There was one of the Royal Bank of Scotland managers, the chief executive, Sir Fred Goodwin, was asked to return some of his pension when the bank did not perform very well after he had left. But in general, the principle would be if you've made an agreement, it's only social pressure that you can apply to reduce these sorts of payments. Other questions we're starting to be asked include things like, we can't run the restaurant and we can't take on the hotel franchise because there's no business and everybody's being made redundant. Does that mean there's an event of force majeure or frustration that means we don't have to go through with the deal? Very difficult questions. It is possible that if you look at the contracts you have signed, epidemics and disease are often included as force majeure events. But in most countries' law, you need the express term to be in the contract. So it very much depends what has been written and agreed between you. Usually these kinds of clauses are things nobody ever looked at. Nobody thought about them at all when they negotiated the contract. They just got some standard rubbish from the textbook and put it in the back. You very rarely see them in employment contracts. So if you're looking at an outsourcing or a merger and acquisition or service provision contract, if you're in the middle of discussing it, look very carefully at your force majeure and walkaway rights. If you've already signed one, be prepared to get out the legal textbooks and take advice, because they're difficult things to get out of, but do depend very much on the contract as it's construed. A second area that we've been starting to think about is the impact of coronavirus on current disputes. In the UK, most courts and tribunals are closing down for physical hearings. They're still having video or telephone hearings. They're also still listing cases at the moment. But we are anticipating a delay in dispute resolution. And while there is a delay, it's also true that people are worrying about credit risk and liquidity. So it could be worth thinking, if you are a business defending litigation from employees or defending non-compete action, think about how the current situation could affect your negotiating position. I'm in 2 negotiations now where the other side are saying, look, this is our offer, and we know you don't like the offer, but you should be prepared to take the money available today against the uncertainty of our security and our financing in the future. So they're using the uncertainty to try and get a discount on the settlement. And that's a real situation. So think about that as you look at the disputes that you currently have. I'm just going to go on to the last substantive slide now very quickly on immigration. It's forgotten very much at the moment because people aren't trying to move. But where you are employing people in your country on work permits and visas, you need to think very carefully about what happens with time running out and extending their visa. Chinese nationals in the UK have got a special exemption, and if their visa was going to expire up to March, it's automatically been extended. But there are other countries, for example, India, which have strong travel restrictions. So if you have Indian work permit holders due to return home, they won't be allowed into India now, even if they're Indian nationals. But their immigration permission may expire in the UK. People need to think about extending their applications to make sure they aren't committing a criminal offence. There is an increased power of detention in the UK and across the world now, where people are travelling who appear to be ill or are travelling for healthcare. Then they can be detained and not admitted into the country. So people need to think very carefully about sending senior management into difficult jurisdictions now. If you're changing the arrangements of migrant workers, you need to take care. So, for example, if you send a migrant worker home, or you reduce their pay, or you have short hours working, then strictly speaking, these are often going to be changes to their role and the basis upon which they were admitted into the country. So it could be that by making changes for migrant workers to have short time, to have home working, you could be in breach of your immigration conditions. And you need to check your national rules about what you need to do to notify the immigration authorities. Our experience is that they are still behind in their thinking about how to adapt for that, and there needs to be much more guidance. But employers should do as much as they can to be seen to ask questions and to regularize the position of these people so that it doesn't look like you're breaching your immigration sponsor rights. Lastly, if you're going to make restructurings and terminations, make sure you keep the right signatories for immigration approvals. If you lose the people who are the authorized officers for managing immigration, it can be very problematic when you're audited later. So I'm conscious that we're coming up to 5 to 5. We still have a couple of minutes potentially available for any questions. But let me just pause and ask the panel if they have any comments or observations.
Well, we see, Sean, that there are so many challenges at the moment in all jurisdictions. Is there some way out of the crisis, some light on the horizon shining a little bit more? What do you think the crisis will have for impacts on the work style in UK?
Well, it probably means we get better microphones and better silencing facilities in houses. I don't think that was my dog in the background. It's early to say. Personally, one thing I feel good about is that in the Taylor Wessing London office, we've been working remotely, pretty much everybody since last Friday. And what we see is that there is a very strong belief that you can work from home and a desire to work from home. It's absolutely not true that employers should worry about home working and breach of trust and lazy workers. Actually, it's the opposite. If anything, there's a concern that because you can get up at 7 o'clock and start working at 7 with no travel, people are working very hard. And so there's a strong positive there that people can make home working work and can be very productive. But I noticed that managers need to work harder to check in with people, to speak with them, to support them, to make sure they feel okay. I went for a walk today and I sent a photo of a tree to my group to encourage them to send me a photo of a tree back to make sure that they were not just sitting at their computer. But maybe Michael, that sort of brings us to some of these thinking forward points. Yes, we're already seeing that it's possible to work agilely and from home. And if you have a 6-week or 12-week period of working from home, that could change your business permanently in terms of reducing the desire for office space, ultimately saving real estate costs, changing the support you have to let people continue to work from home. If they can work from home in a crisis, why not work from home normally? So that could very much change some of the costs of work in the future and the use of real estate. I think I also see that lawyers are a little bit more popular for a short time. That won't last, but risk management is going to become a core element in any international planning. Disaster recovery, but resilience, managing supply chain, not be too concentrated in your suppliers. That discipline of horizon scanning, risk management, and being a responsible manager, managing downside risk as well as profit opportunity. is likely to be something that results in changing management style. Maybe looking less at profit and more at security and sustainability. And that could mean if we all see that we're not traveling, maybe the green agenda that a lot of younger workers have might become much more strong in the future, that they say, well, it's not necessary for senior management to have a sales conference in Athens. We can have team meetings virtually, we can still have fun, but you don't need to travel, you can be greener. And that also allies with this idea of the connected company. We're all working very hard to share know-how. This is an example. And maybe we don't always get it completely right, but after this webinar, you'll see banks of resources that you can access online. There'll be further updates to people who have participated. And this situation forces us all to be more sharing about knowledge and resources, so that could be a very important effect in the medium and longer term. It sort of goes with social responsibility. Maybe it means we pay more attention to the social agenda and the sustainability agenda in terms of what good work looks like. Maybe the coronavirus accelerates some of the thinking around the changing workplace, the idea of what good work looks like and modern work looks like over the next 20, 50, 100 years. We might have accidentally accelerated all these changes, and we really need to be thinking about the measures we take now to survive, what those do to affect our future options and our future expectations, the expectations on us from our colleagues. Because what we do now to react and just survive might dictate how we have to work in the future. So it needs careful thought for the medium term, not just the next few weeks and months. I hope that sounded quite thoughtful. I guess, like everybody else, I'm thinking about it as we go along. We're all thinking pretty hard. If anybody has any closing observations or questions, I will welcome them. It's just at 5 o'clock, however. So shout out if there's anything pressing from any of the panel.
Maybe only the last thing, as you mentioned, Sean, we have some useful links for you. We are willing to share our knowledge with the audience. You can use our Corona hotlines, the Corona emails mentioned in the presentation. And of course, Sean, it's now you to have the closing words. We are a little bit over the time.
All right, so the closing words are, stay strong, look after your colleagues, and look after your business. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.